It's Parshas Tetze, but it's also Elul. And Elul, we're hunting for tshuva, which is sometimes elusive, authentic, heartfelt, genuine, soul-searching tshuva. And sometimes we deal with symptoms. Even when we set our minds and our hearts towards authentic, genuine tshuva, it's so easy to find symptoms and to try to solve them. But it's like weeds. You can just cut them from the surface, but if you don't get down to the root, you rarely eliminate them long term. Ya'azov rashad darko v'ish aven machshev osav. We're looking not just for the chatoim, but for the derech, the road. Factors, environmental, psychological, personal, cultural, whatever they are, that constantly lead us back to chet. How do we find the root and uproot rather than the symptom and just cover it with Tylenol? So, interestingly enough, Parshas Tetze provides a story, Nifas Torah, which is the anatomy of chet and why we sin and how we respond to our urges and our desires. And embedded within Rashi is a basic understanding of how we create halos and fantasies about issues and temptations that shouldn't be as strong as they are. So the first Rashi is well known in Parshas Tetze, Dibra Torah Keneged Yetzirah. The HaKadosh Baruch Hu understands human nature, the stress of war, human needs, and in a very provocative halacha, instead of banning Yifas Torah or banning those needs and urges, the Torah redirects them in a way that's halachically framed and halachically validated by the halachas of Yifas Torah. So that in and of itself reminds us that sometimes when we locate our urges and our desires, so sometimes we want to try to eliminate them and expunge them and cancel them, but very often it's about finding other outlets for them, not necessarily the outlet of Yifas Torah, but understanding what our needs are and dealing with them. And as we grow through life and go through life, sometimes it's eliminating them, sometimes it's managing them and finding healthier ways to express them. But it's clear that the goal of the Yifas Torah is that this marriage shouldn't last. As Chazal tell us, if it lasts, then it's likely to lead to a hated wife and a loved wife, and to a Ben Sora Amara, the series of Yifas Torah, hated wives and loved wives, Havan Snua, and then of course ending in the tragedy of Ben Sora Amara. So the goal is, as the Torah writes, the goal is V'hayam lo chafatz bo. We're trying to get to a point where this man loses his attraction and his interest in this non-Jewish woman who he took in battle, in the middle of battle. And there are steps that are taken. She has to grow her nails, which at least in certain cultures is unattractive. She has to take off her very attractive, tempting clothing that she probably wore to the battlefield in order to entice soldiers from the other side. So she's presumably going to be mourning her father and her lost culture that she's been taken from. But there is one phrase that Rashi highlights. She should v'yashva b'veisecha. She should sit in your home. Well, where else would she be sitting? Of course, you've taken her into your home, into your family. Of course, she'll be living in your family as a toxic provocateur. So Rashi says, b'vayishem ishtamesh bo. She should sit not just in one of your houses, off in the frontier, in the forest, some annex that you have, but in your house that you're constantly living in, walking through. Nichnas, you walk in, you walk out. V'niskal ba, and you encounter her. Ro'eh b'v'chiyasa, you see her crying. Ro'eh b'nivula, you see her less attractive. Kadesh tizgana elav, so that she should be something which is unattractive and repulsive to you, and hopefully you'll discontinue this very toxic and dangerous relationship. Rashi is helping us address the anatomy, or more precisely, the psychology of sin. What is the psychology of sin? Well, that's a hard question, a complex question, but very often we create fantasy around objects, people, ideas that make them seem larger and more attractive than they really are. And we, to use a modern expression, we Photoshop them. And what leads to fantasy? Well, certainly the stress of war. In wartime, when men feel stress and feel fear and tension, so we can find ourselves being attracted to find a release for that pent-up energy, the release for tension, and we find ourselves in similarly stressful situations. Stressful situations, psychologically stressful situations, are some of those dangerous moments because we fall prey to our weaker impulses. We fall prey, and it's a synthetic environment, wartime. People are seen in ways that they aren't when they're under the duress of war. And it's not just the war, but she's from a different country and sometimes distance, and makes things feel exotic and more attractive. It's not the humdrum dreariness of our day-to-day life. And Very often we find ourselves chasing people, chasing ideas, chasing desires, because they appear to us in ways that aren't realistic. Fantasy can never survive the sobering effects of reality. And when we see things as they really are, rather than as our mind plays tricks on us and make us see in ways that are intensified or exaggerated by fantasy. And fantasy is a very deep psychological need for escape, for something else, to break the monotony of our routine. And if we understand that about ourselves and we ask ourselves, well, if I strip away all the layers of fantasy and assumption, so what would happen if the object of your fantasy, let's say the person, whether it's a hero, whether they were to walk in the room, they would be like you and me. And you would be less attracted to them than you are certainly in a world which dresses them up with ornamentals and creates larger-than-life imagery and larger-than-life attraction. And that's part of what's happening with the Yifas Tower. This man saw this woman in battle. She was from a different country. She wasn't Jewish, something exotic, something different, something not part of our day-to-day. And he was so attracted that he took her into his home. And that could create many, many potential hazards in his home. So part of it is trying to, I would say, stack the deck and make her seem in ways that are unattractive. Long nails, crying, different types of clothing. Part of it is, Rashi says, just let her sit in your house and you'll see her as she is, a human being like anyone else. No more attractive, no less attractive. She cries like a human being. She breathes like a human being. She gets dirty like a human being. And all of a sudden, this cold shower of reality can wipe away some of the intense temptations that fantasy sometimes creates for us. So the takeaway for us is, as Chodesh Elul is here, what sins do we commit because we're led astray by the temptations of fantasy that dress things up and magnify them more than they actually are, so that they exert a pull and a sway on us in ways that they shouldn't. Shabbat Shalom.